Hello, everyone. Uh, Thanks for joining us. I'm trying to find Professor Elaine as well, add her. Sorry, let me bring. Hello.
Hey, how are you?
Hi, Elaine. How are you?
Good.
Nice to meet you again.
Yeah.
And thanks everyone for coming. I think you should. Everyone should hear us fine. Elaine, do you hear me well?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Good. I hear you well as well. Yeah, there are some of these people who are joining. Thanks for everyone who is joining. So essentially, I had some talks in like some of this live in person before. Then I saw actually the interest, and I talked with Professor Shi as well, and we decided actually to we can now go and have some kind of series that we are talking more about our life as a scientist. I mean, first, probably we will start with computer scientists, like well-known computer scientists such as Professor Shi, and then we talk about other scientists as well. You may hear a lot about, I mean, I don't know, celebrities in industry, in Hollywood or others, but maybe less on scientists. And here, and again, lots of people actually are interested to become scientists, and that is the whole goal, especially in this area of STEM, which stands for science, technology, engineering, and math. So we try to, I mean, talk a little bit about our life. That's the idea that we have it essentially. We talk a little bit about our lives essentially as scientists, and I mean, what was the motivation for us, and several other stuff. Especially, it is useful for general people. Then we will talk about our research essentially, maybe a little bit more in detail at some places, essentially for the people who are interested in more detailed type of research and like the state of the art. And I mean, we try to, I mean, give any good things that we think it is good, of course. That is our belief. It may or may not be correct for others, but at least that's a recommendation that we are making essentially. Good. So that is great. I think with this introduction, then we will go and talk, start the talk with Professor Shi. Okay, so she's actually a great computer scientist. I will just mention a little bit introduction for her. So I actually became familiar with her. I think that was the spring of 2011 that she came for an interview for a faculty job at University of Maryland. And since then, essentially, she has excelled in all aspects. And I mean, she has like several awards, like a Sloan Fellowship, Packard Fellowship, Honor Young Investigator Awards, and others. She joined the University of Maryland in 2012, and then she essentially joined Cornell, CS Cornell in 2015 and 2021 CMU, where she is now a professor of computer science and I think electrical engineering as well. So, before that, I mean, she also, I mean, has been in Tsinghua University, got her bachelor there, and PhD also from the same place, CMU. Actually, I think we were both at CMU in the span of 2006 to 2007, and probably I think we met, but maybe we didn't talk that much. Maybe we talked more after she joined at UMD. Good. I think and she has been also in Xerox Park in between, like after graduation and before joining essentially academy. I think you were sometime also at Berkeley, like as a research scientist.
Yes, I was there for 1 year.
Great. Okay, so with this introduction, I mean, we have, and she's, I mean, working essentially on crypto stuff, on security, on blockchain, and famous for those essentially works. So with that, essentially, we will go and start essentially talking about our lives, and I will start essentially here. I mean, this just brief intro, and I will let Professor Elaine Shi to talk more essentially about her life. Essentially, she has more time to talk, of course. Yeah. So when I was a child, essentially, I remember I was like in, I think maybe middle school. I was taking a bus to come from a school to home. At that time, I was thinking. I mean, like I was a student in Qazvin, a city close to Tehran. And I was thinking, can I go? I mean, is there any chance that I can be essentially a student at Sharif University? Sharif University is, like, I think, considered the best school in US, in Iran. And it's very hard to get in. I think lots of people know about it. Now, with this introduction, and of course, I mean, I was happy, I mean, that I could actually not only went to Sharif, but also I got like into International Olympiad in Informatics. I went to MIT, and after that, I mean, joined as a faculty of the University of Maryland and several industries. With this introduction, I mean, Professor, she went to the best university, I will consider it in China, Tsinghua University. So with that, I will essentially start asking the question, is that, I mean, essentially, did you imagine that you become essentially a scientist when you were essentially a child? Especially like become a famous computer scientist and got lots of awards essentially, and being essentially a professor in top school. Did you had any role models? Yeah, so I think that's all yours.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, when I was a child, I wasn't very ambitious at all. My parents grew up during the Cultural Revolution in China. So like both of them didn't go to college. And then my mother went to TV college, like after she came back to the city. So like for them, they were always like regretful that they didn't go to college or anything. So I always like thought, okay, maybe college is a good thing to go to, but maybe it's also like, you know, a little out of reach. And so, and I liked listening to like scientist stories when I was a child, but they were always just like stories, and I never like associated, you know, being a scientist with myself. So I guess like interestingly, maybe like part of my life was kind of a process of like discovering myself, like what I liked. And I guess like maybe sometime in middle school or high school, like at some point I realized, oh, actually I have good grades and I could go to college.
So great. So I think, is there any special, I mean, schools, like for example in China for like talented students essentially? Because in Iran there are something, it is called, I mean, for talented students, they have created these schools that it was also hard to get in. So in some sense, if you want to go to, I mean, become like more in the math and essentially like physics and other STEM type of things, you could go first to, I mean, these are schools and then go there. So was there such a schools also in China essentially too?
So my high school is kind of like is one of the most prestigious middle school and high school in my city. And they basically have some kind of well, in my times, like they had some kind of a exam every year to basically admit the top students in my city, Hangzhou. And I was lucky enough that I got into
Very good. So what was the city name that you were essentially grew up there?
I grew up in Hangzhou. So Hangzhou is about a 2 hours drive from Shanghai. It's like famous for the tourism, but it's also actually the e-commerce and finance center these days. Like Alibaba is actually headquartered.
Yeah, that's like, I think now it is a great center actually. And I think other than Alibaba, I think other places, other top China industry also are there essentially. So
yeah,
that is great. So I think, and then I think there is an exam to go to Tsinghua as well, correct?
Yeah, I was actually very fortunately waived off this matriculation exam. So in China, basically the way it works is every year they have a nationally standardized exam called the college matriculation exam. Everyone takes the same exam, and then like they tell you the score, and then you basically fill in some form to like indicate which universities are your top choices, and then they do the matching. So for me, like I was pretty lucky because I participated in this programming contest, and I did pretty well. So I was able to like get into Tsinghua without having to take the matriculation exam.
And what was that programming contest?
So we call it the National Olympiad in Informatics. So basically, first, like each province will do like a province-wide selection, and then they send a team. Like in my times, like every team consisted of 3 contestants. So we basically went to the national level contest, and then they basically, you sit there for like half a day, 4 hours. It's a little bit like just like the IOI, the International Olympiad in Informatics. I didn't go to the IOI, but this is like
that's actually quite interesting. So I didn't know that. So that's good actually. I knew that you were doing some programming, but I didn't know actually you have participated in this kind of IOI type of things essentially. Yeah, I think I essentially was fortunate to go essentially to represent Iran in I think 1997 for International Olympiad. But actually that's the thing that we were talking in Iran, that like essentially in China to becoming the 4-people team is like much harder to get essentially gold in the IOI because that's more selective essentially to population, etc. So, and this thing that you mentioned is actually very similar in Iran. Like, for example, if you can get the gold medal in the national level in Iran, even though there are like 6 to 8 people get it essentially. Even though if they cannot go to international competition, still they will can go essentially to any university in the area that they want. So it is very similar actually. And because in Iran also there is exactly this exam that you mentioned. And this, but there, you don't need to essentially, you can just wave and go there. So that actually, it happened to me as well. I'm not sure that if I have passed the test, maybe I couldn't go actually to share it. But this way the best that I actually went there. So, like essentially, great. And the people, if you have a question, you can put it there and we will talk also about those things as well. Great. Now, the next question. So, like, was there any difference in China regarding like learning math and computer science by boys or girls? So, was there any like feel like obstacle, or it was like common for both girls and boys that they are going to this more STEM type of things essentially?
I think when I was growing up, there was like the general stereotype that girls are bad at math. And I was also like, repeatedly told about it. Like I had good math grades in elementary school, but then, people kept telling me, girls, maybe your math grade will drop in middle school, it will drop in high school. So I thought this, like, I never thought, okay, I'm going to prove you wrong. I just thought this was going to happen. And my math grade was somehow going to drop. And I remember there was like a couple of times, like I always did very well in like math exams and stuff. There was like this once I didn't do so well. And in retrospect, because I didn't really study. But then, when I didn't do so well, I was like, okay, yeah, my math grade is dropping. It's the prophecy. It's happening.
Yeah, that's actually great. I'm very happy that you didn't listen to them essentially. And I think that is like great. So tell me, like, I think
I did. Like, I believed it was going to be true, but I think part of going to middle school and high school was like discovering actually it was not the case. For myself, yeah.
So yeah, that's great actually. I mentioned this. I have essentially one boy and 2 daughters essentially, and so that is important that to have essentially the role model. And I think here also in US it is somehow like that. I have some of my classes, some more like the theory classes, and unfortunately some of them not too many essentially female students we have it, which I don't feel good. I really want to have more female students, and the issue that these are like boosting essentially. So if there are not too many students essentially, like female students in a class, then probably less will also be willing to come, because they say, oh, this is all boy class. And so yeah, so that's great. I'm very happy that you didn't, I mean, listen and you have been essentially continued that you are there and we are talking now. Good. So I think, yeah. So when did you decide essentially about like to decide that you want to go to computer science? I think probably partly to this comes to this programming type of thing.
Yeah. So actually, there's I have a pretty long story about how I got into computer science. I guess.
I think that's great. I mean, we will be. I mean, very willing to hear essentially. Go ahead.
So when I was in middle school, like our middle school had like a computer club, and they like once the computer instructor in our middle school, she invited a college instructor from Hangzhou University to teach about C programming in our middle school. So a couple of my buddies, they decided to enroll in this like class, and you know I was always hanging out with them, right? But they were like guys, so I said, okay, you know, you guys are going to this class, I'm going to go as well, just to hang out with you. So I went to this C programming class, and you know, of course, like I didn't really pay attention in class. I didn't listen. I didn't learn anything. And what I didn't realize was like one day the teacher said, okay, we are going to have a final exam. And I totally panicked. I was like, oh, actually, there's going to be an exam. And I really have to study. So fortunately, my mother, like she was managing a team of computer scientists to like develop the social insurance information, the IT system for the whole city. And so then
mom was doing that?
My mother was like directing a team of computer scientists, like computer engineers to do that. So I like basically complained to my mother, and my mother said, okay, I'm going to ask our engineers to teach you how to program. So I guess I got some private tutoring from, you know, my mother's friends, and I did well in the final exam. And then what I didn't realize was like, I actually, you know, other students were just like myself. Like most people like thought it was a club, and they didn't really, you know, pay too much attention in class. And most people didn't do very well. So then the computer teacher, like she singled me out, and she said, okay, you know, you did well in this exam. You have to participate in this programming contest. I was like, oh my God, now I have to like participate in programming contest. Now I have to like really learn about algorithms and learn about programming more. So I bought like some algorithms book for high school students, and I started like reading the algorithms book. And at this moment, I really got serious. Like I started to, you know, go to they had like a computer room in the middle school. So I basically, you know, started teaching myself how to program. Like I would implement the algorithms in that book. Because I was like pretty nervous about this contest. And so I went to this contest, and then they like asked me, you know, do you want to attend this advanced tier or this like lower tier? I said, you know, of course the lower tier. I have no idea what this is like. So I went to this lower tier, and then it turns out the problems like were pretty easy. Like basically the exam was like 4 hours or something, and I finished everything within like 30 minutes. And I checked it like a couple of times, and I got too bored, so I basically just like left after, I don't know, 45 minutes or something. And then they said, oh, actually, you know, you had 4 score, and now you have to like participate in this training in the province, and then, you know, you need to like somehow enter the selection for the national level contest. So I was kind of pushed to do all of this, like, and I didn't anticipate all of it happening. So I did went to this training camp organized by the province. And then like in the next year, I was like selected into this provincial team, and I entered the national level contest. So yeah, so I mean, but this was like, it had more twists and turns. So the thing is, like, I was training with a bunch of other, mostly guys, and I didn't really like it for the following reason, because like most other people there, like they started learning programming like in elementary school. So like they were always like hanging out together, and they were very close friends. And I was like, okay, this only person who was like joining late. I started learning programming late, and I wasn't kind of like part of the same clique. And I felt like, okay, the guys didn't want to talk to me. They were always like, discussing problems together among themselves. They were always playing games together amongst themselves. And I didn't feel part of it. So I tried to quit this national level contest. And what I did was I called the coach, and he was on the provincial educational board. And I told him, like, I don't want to participate in the national level contest. Because, I mean, I couldn't tell him, like, I didn't want to go because the guys didn't want to talk to me. I was just like, oh, I have to study for the college matriculation exam, and that's going to be time consuming. and I don't have time to study for this programming contest. And then he was like very, very insistent. Like we had this really, really long phone call, like maybe 2 to 3 hours, because he was like really trying to convince me to go to this national level contest. And I tried to quit. And then, so he was like, I mean, I think partly the reason why they really wanted me there was because like, so every team must have one girl, otherwise like it doesn't qualify for team score. So that year, actually, our province, Zhejiang province, was hosting like this contest, and then I think the provincial educational board, like they put a lot of resources, like they wanted to basically really do well. So they really needed a girl to participate, and then I think I was like probably the only choice. And then like, so he basically tried to convince me for like 2 hours, and I still like firmly refused. And in the end, he said, okay, I can convince like the province to waive you of like all these standardized tests. And I was like, oh, this is a good deal, right? Because I didn't like some of these subjects in these like standardized tests. I didn't want to study for them. So I was like, oh yeah, maybe that's a good deal. If like, you could waive me of that, I would, I could agree to like participate in this national level contest. So then like he said, we can waive you of these tests, but we'll give you a B. And I was like, no, you have to give me A. Otherwise. So basically like he convinced the province to like waive all of the contestants, like not just myself and the other team members as well. So we all got waived off the standardized tests, so we could like focus on preparing for this programming contest. But I mean, in retrospect, like it was like pretty fortunate that eventually I did participate, because I did like do pretty well. I wasn't actually gold medal. I was just silver medal. I was like the 9th, I remember. And then because of that, I was like offered admission to Tsinghua University without having to take matriculation exam.
I think so. This one, that the province one that they essentially they waived, that was different from Tsinghua requirement that they waived when you actually achieved it.
Yeah, those are just like standardized tests like they gave to every high school student. It's not part of the college matriculation exam, but it's part of the requirement for you to finish high school.
Oh, I see. But the other one, I think because you got this silver medal there, essentially, then they gave you this admission, essentially.
Yeah, then I received the admission, and then I was selecting major. But by that time, like I had made some friends during the national level contest. So like all of my friends went to computer science. I wasn't actually I still was not convinced that I wanted to do computer science at that point. And the only reason like was, okay, all my friends are going there, I didn't want to be left alone. So I went there as well.
That's great, actually. I mean, they pushed you. I mean, and I think you have chosen the path correctly. I mean, I think at the end, I think nowadays, essentially computer science, of course, I mean, you could be successful in other areas, but I think computer science is like one of the best area, for studying science, essentially now. Great. So, because I think this one that you mentioned, I had also similar things when I was I mentioned that, I was in that bus going from school to home, and I was thinking whether I can essentially go to Sharif University. But actually, go to IUI, that was, it's much, much harder, because generally, lots of, good number of people are going to Sharif University, but only maybe, 4 people from Iran, for example, go to IUI essentially each year. And like at each step that I was advancing, essentially, I was not sure whether I can go to the other one. It was like far-reaching, essentially, for me to get to the next step. And I remember actually it was so there was an exam essentially. It was like a summer camping. I was in the summer camp. I was fortunate to go to the summer camp, and then at the end of the science, like this summer camp for computer science essentially or IOI, they were selecting 8 people, actually 6 people to become part of essentially the gold medal, such that they have some kind of like several months, sometime to 1 year even, essentially preparation. But you needed to get the gold essentially to go this team. And I remember it was like before announcing that, so it was a very harsh competition during these 3 months in the summer. And like at the end of it, I remember because we had exactly the same exam essentially. So either you needed to get essentially gold, such that if you got gold, then you could go to any university. If you didn't get gold, at that time there was no other provision. Then you needed to go actually and do, it is some general exam to get essentially into colleges. That is called concours essentially. So then I needed to go there. I remember actually just 2-3 days before announcing the result, I was not sure that whether I will get into six people or not. And it was like a very huge competition. I was actually and for this concours also, the people are studying quite long time, 2-3 years essentially. The higher school, when they go to higher school, essentially they are just studying for the concours. And it was a huge risk also for me during my higher school time actually to go to try for essentially informatics Olympiad, because in my city actually there were not too many people that they were doing this. Like there was no person essentially. There was only one person 10 years before me that he could get essentially a bronze medal in the international maths Olympiad, but no other person essentially. So it was very risky. And just 2-3 days in this summer camp before essentially announcing the result, I remember actually I had all my chemistry book from high school and I started reading them essentially. Okay, I'm not sure that I will go there. I need to start preparing, because just essentially almost 9 months after that time I needed to participate in concours. So it was like these things that happens essentially, sometimes happens and changes in your life. But yeah, that's essentially the something that happens and you will be very happy. Now you will have it, you may not feel it, but at that time it was quite actually impossible. And I think these are the things that you say, essentially saying the same type of things. And essentially I think for all people essentially, especially female students or others, they should, like if there are less people, I think you should not be afraid of it. I think that's your story, that you always, they encourage you, but you went and essentially you excelled in all of these competitions. And how was the things at Tsinghua University? So, what is the ratio of for example, in computer science, how many female versus male students? Are there also big difference there or not?
I think in my class it was about 1 to 7. Like we had so few girls that. So when we had the college and the intramural basketball game within the college, like every department was supposed to send a team. So we had so few women, what they asked is, have you ever touched the basketball? If you have touched the basketball, you have to join the level.
Yeah, that's a very nice story, essentially. But actually, that's nice. This type of things that they had it, I think that's actually, I think these are some, good rules that they had it, because I think that's at least participate, allows more participation, because if there is no such rules, for example, there is such kind of things also in the ACM. So essentially this IOI is more for higher school students. ACM, ICPC, now it is not ACM, it's just ICPC programming contest. That's a teamwork. IOI was essentially more individual people. Mm-hmm. And then also they had for 3 people. I think I know that in the international level now, if the teams have at least one girl essentially or one female student, then they have some kind of essentially some award for just those teams. And again, not too many teams actually have that. So that's a very good actually that they had such a rule essentially for teams for essentially informatics Olympiad, or essentially also for even basketball. I think that's a good way of putting, essentially mixing people such that they can be essentially more diverse. And I think diversity is very important for me. That's like the...
Yeah, I also went to like a ICPC regional, but it was like a last minute thing. So because our university decided last minute, they wanted to send our girls team. So like we didn't even train at all. Like they were just last minute, they told us, okay, now you have to go to this ICPC. So like with 3 girls, like we got together and we just like participated. We did reasonably well, but it was like not good enough to like enter the next level.
Yeah,
partly because we never like studied or prepared for it.
Yeah, I mean, some countries like essentially, I mean, China or Russia or I mean, Iran, I think Poland. There are some. I mean, US also at some level. At some level, it becomes actually very hard. I mean, these are like the. I mean, these people I think care about those type of things, and at some level, and it becomes actually hard. And essentially, you need to do a lot of exams, like a lot of practice essentially, and exercise in that. And yeah, I mentioned essentially some of the time that I wanted to get into programming style, I was writing the code for weighted matching. That's one of the hardest one essentially if you want to code it essentially. Even like just matching in general graph is the hard one actually. And I was just typing that. I mean, it took actually like this Blossom algorithm great algorithm by Edmonds essentially. We can talk about it. But yeah, that's like a good thing essentially to. That was a good thing for me to try such that I can get into the mood of programming. And that's the thing, because you need to do a lot of exercise and this to go there essentially. Great. So how about the life essentially like as a graduate student at CMU? So I think after that, so 4 years you have been at Tsinghua and then you applied essentially for US school, I believe, correct?
Sorry, for 4 years, what was the question again, the last part?
Yeah, so you were essentially 4 years at Tsinghua, correct?
4 years at what?
So, like for undergrad was 4 years.
Tsinghua, yeah. I was 4 years and I did my undergrad in Tsinghua and then I went to CMU for grad school.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, yeah. Sorry, I mean, I couldn't pronounce it. I think Tsinghua. That's the correct thing. I tried to. I mean, it is called written with T, but I was thinking that it's S. But yeah, Tsinghua University. So 4 years you have been there, and then you applied essentially for US school, I assume. So have you applied to other schools other than CMU, other top schools like MIT, Stanford, other places?
Yeah, I applied like it was also like I wasn't very confident and I didn't like have very good calibration like which university I could get into. So I just basically applied to like the top 30 or something. I applied everywhere and then I think CMU was like the top ranking offer that I got. And I wasn't actually even sure that I wanted to go to CMU. Like I was never very confident of myself. I was like, oh, maybe, you know, would I actually measure up to CMU? Like, you know, I heard that their program is difficult. Like people were telling me it takes very long to like graduate. It would take 8 years. I was kind of scared. But I think, I mean, fortunately, I think my friends and my, you know, family, my teachers in like college, like they all believed in me and they encouraged me to like go to CMU.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, do you think, I mean, that might be because I mean, not maybe, like, do you think it is, like, have you talked, like, with other people, like, was it common also, this feeling, or maybe it was, like, in China, or just maybe among the female students in China, so was it like that, essentially, or just was you, essentially, that were not confident?
I mean, maybe it was partly me, but also, like, I guess, in general, like from my conversations with female colleagues, I feel like maybe, you know, I know other female colleagues maybe who felt the same way. Like,
because I think for me, like it was like that essentially. I mean, when I went to MIT, I think there were some of my essentially friends, essentially some of the teachers actually that we had it at this informatics Olympiad camp. They were already there, so I really didn't feel that way essentially. Maybe because there were some other people. So, okay, if they could do that, I can do that as well. So that might be, I will say, I mean, that's essentially having role models. Now, I think everyone can now look at you and then they try to excel as well, essentially, male or female, essentially. Great. So, yeah, and okay, how about the life at CMU, essentially, like at the PhD student in general?
So when I was in grad school, like I guess I didn't aim to go to academia when I was a grad student. So I think I did research, but I also spent a lot of time like doing other things, like playing games, enjoying myself, hanging out with friends. So in that sense, it was a lot of fun.
What type of game did you play?
I played several games. Like one is this arcade game called Dance Dance Revolution. Like I think during some time in grad school, like we would go play for a couple hours every day. And I also played some other games like Age of Empires. And I actually injured my wrist really badly playing Age of Empires and the Dance Dance Revolution. Age of Empires is like a real-time strategy game.
Yeah. I didn't play that essentially, but yeah, I'm aware of it essentially. Like I was playing actually more when I was in the IOI camps essentially. We were doing Duke and Doom and other type of things actually. That was after after we had several essentially contests. After each of them, we needed to go there essentially and to just after the exam, such that we have some kind of time. We were killing each other essentially on Doom or Duke if you played essentially. But like maybe those type of things that we were playing these computer games essentially. And and I think after you got your PhD in 2008.
Yeah.
So did you feel too much competition at CMU or I mean?
I guess maybe. I mean, grad school is like you are not measured by your grades, right? So we are just all working on our own research.
Exactly.
I mean, there were definitely like periods of time like I felt maybe I was a little stuck in research. I think that may have happened to a lot of people. But CMU is like in general, it's a pretty relaxed and nice environment. Like we, hung out together with our friends, and it was. In general, I think it was very nice. When I these days when I chatted with my peers in grad school, like we all agree like grad school was kind of like utopia. We didn't have to worry about anything. We didn't have to worry about much except maybe just like our own research.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I felt exactly that. I mean, because like MIT and CMU both are like top schools essentially in computer science. When I was at MIT, I mean, like the first year maybe I didn't feel that much competition. I went to actually IBM, I think Almaden to visit there, and somebody asked, I mean, like after the first year, did you feel competition essentially at MIT? At that time, I said maybe no. I mean, that was just my first year. But the next 3 years, actually, I felt quite a bit of competition. And I was just thinking, just mentioning essentially, I remember one that was a fax deadline. It was essentially almost 1 or 2 a.m. Me and Eric Demain, I mean, we were writing a paper submission for fax, I think a day after or something like this. And then we were leaving essentially the CSAIL at that time to school to go home. And at that time, essentially, Peter he came actually and he said, "Oh, what are you doing?" I said, "Okay, I just had my dinner and I just coming for doing after 2 a.m. essentially to continue writing the paper." But when I came to CMU, actually I found it much more relaxed. Like, of course, I mean, like a top school, but I think it's more relaxed. After 5 p.m., I mean, not too many faculties were there. Of course, I mean, they made work essentially from home. But that was, I think, a bit different story for me. It was not that much pressure that I felt essentially at MIT. And again, I think it means that most of them worked essentially.
Yeah, I remember like we never kind of felt like peer pressure. Like we never compare with our peers, like how many papers we have or, whether if you had a stock paper, I must have a stock paper too. Like we never had that kind of thing. And for me, like I wasn't actually aiming to go to academia afterwards. And I didn't think I needed so many papers. I just needed enough to like get the PhD. Like I think in the beginning, I was actually worried about surviving the grad school. Like I guess maybe this is also part of this confidence thing. I wasn't like so confident, and I was like, would I be able to do research? Can I survive grad school?
Yeah, but I think you have done great in all of them. So I think anytime that you were, I think, not confident from now on, you know that you will be successful there. So you can be confident now essentially about anything. Now the other thing is, so after 2008, for how many years you have been at Xerox PARC?
3 years.
So 3 years essentially you were at industry, and so okay, I think, now essentially comes to the next question. Essentially, system versus theory. I think your PhD was more on the system. So can you tell us a little bit about your PhD topic and what did you?
Oh yeah, actually, I also have an interesting story about this. So like when I first joined CMU, like we have this advisor matching, and you have to find an advisor like in the first couple of months.
Yes.
So like I was good at, programming because I participated in these programming contests. So I thought, okay, I could build systems. But I mean, because I participated in programming contests, I also thought I was good at algorithms. So I was like, oh, maybe I should do theory. And I was like, okay, I couldn't decide, and I didn't want to be committal. So I thought, okay, maybe I'll pick some topic that would kind of allow me to move along the theory system spectrum. And so I consider machine learning because I feel like, oh, machine learning, there's learning theory. I could do learning theory, but if I didn't like learning theory, I could do machine learning applications. So I started by talking to some machine learning faculty, but it turned out none of them were taking students. And then my advisor, Adrian Perrick, so he was a new professor at that time, and he was like very eager to take on new students. Actually, he reached out to me and he said, let's chat about research. So I went and chatted with Adrian, and he like tried to convince me to like study security. And I thought, okay, maybe security is also something that would allow me to, move back and forth between like theory and systems. Because if I wanted to do theory, I could do crypto. If I wanted to do systems, I could do like system security. So I thought, okay, maybe, I could do security. And then I also liked Adrian, like when I talked to him. So I decided to pick Adrian as my advisor. So then I started working on, so my advisor's main focus is like system security, right? So like in the first couple of years of my PhD, I focused on system security. Like I was basically, like I was like very junior. I didn't know how to select research topics. So I just worked on whatever my advisor thought was a good topic. And then like very quickly, I published like several papers in top conferences in security. And at that moment, I felt like, okay, it looks pretty certain that I'm going to eventually get a PhD. But I was like very bothered that because all the systems I have built, like I was working on like trusted hardware at that time. And I felt like, okay, I couldn't prove the system secure. And I was very, very bothered by it. I thought, I must be able to prove the system secure. And I didn't know like what tools was needed. So I said, okay, I'm going to like teach myself crypto and do crypto research. So that was like the motivation. But of course, I didn't know what was the right tool that was needed to prove like to model this trusted hardware. So I just picked up some random topic in crypto. I picked up this paper by Bonnet et al., like some bilinear group identity-based encryption paper. And so I picked up some random problem, which was to build like an encryption system that allows like multi-dimensional range query. So this problem came from like some application. Like I remember I was talking to some HCI researchers and they had this problem. So I said to myself, I want to solve this crypto problem. And I found like the most relevant paper, which was like this paper by Bonnet. And I think I was very, very lucky because I had like a scheme in a couple of weeks. So basically, I wrote up this paper and we sent it to a conference. But this was not the end of the story. So the more interesting part is I discovered that my result was scooped by like, top cryptographers in the field. By like, there was a paper by Dan Bonnet and Brent Waters, and they had been like basically leading this area. And the way I discovered it was like in the most weird manner. I was asked to review a paper for this conference. And I looked at this paper and I was like, oh, this paper has identical results as my paper. I was like totally panicking. I told this person, I cannot review this paper. I have a conflict of interest. And I was very, very nervous because, of course, I thought this was like the last crypto paper I was ever going to write. And fortunately, so I submitted the paper the first time. It got rejected. I think their paper was like actually rejected too. And then we both like submitted our paper again, and theirs got in first. And then I was like submitting my paper to like a top tier conference. And I was thinking, okay, if it didn't get in this time, like basically the result would have been scooped. But fortunately, it did get in. So like, Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually, I mean, like these are talking about essentially conferences in computer science. This unfortunate, I mean, like fortunate or unfortunate that we are submitting essentially for general audience that like if you are doing research in computer science, I mean, conferences are the main venues essentially. There are still some good journals, but I mean, so I'm just essentially changing a little bit my position. I think if you can go a little bit back, that might be good also. So it hits some of your. So can you go? Yeah, I think that's better.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe more in the middle. You can just think.
Okay, yeah, I can move this a little bit backwards.
Yeah, I think that is good. I think now it's better. I think I have the same problem as well that people will mention to me. Yeah, so in computer science, essentially, we are submitting our papers essentially to conferences. And that's it. I mean, somehow unfortunate things that the people will put it on archive. Archive is a different story that we can talk about it. But we submit it to conferences. And this is unfortunate that if you have two results at the same time, some other groups have the same results essentially. And if they submit it essentially, if the program committee decide essentially they accept their paper and not your paper, which can happen essentially. Big conferences, there is not much actually coordination sometimes. Small conferences, again, this may happen because of anything. In particular, these other guys may have a stronger results, a little bit stronger results or others. And unfortunately, the second paper in that case will be essentially scooped, as you mentioned. And I think it didn't happen in this case for you. I mean, it happened several times for me that, I mean, generally then you cannot get the best conference anymore. If it was just journals, of course, probably didn't matter because you could both send it and then they can possibly get accepted essentially and more archival things. But in the conferences, the issue is that when one of them appears, then in the conference accepted in one conference, then there is less motivation for the second conference to accept your paper because in some sense they say, okay, conferences know for essentially announcing the results. I mean, somehow the result has been announced in an earlier conference. Why should I essentially do it? I think we had the same issue with one of our papers essentially, that this is our joint paper essentially that we had it. We submitted to NURIPS essentially. There was a paper like ICML at that time that we understood. And then we needed, I mean, we were fortunate actually the paper got accepted to AIS. That. Good. So a little bit about, I mean, security. So what is system security essentially? I mean, I think that's the thing that we can go more essentially. What's the difference between system security and crypto essentially?
I guess, I mean, system security, so both are pretty broad topics. Like in system security, like you would, let's say, build secure systems. Let's say I want to design a new, secure platform for cloud computing, or I want to like design a secure processor. So these are, kind of system security. Or maybe I want to find an attack to like existing system, like whatever, like, websites. And then in crypto, it's more like we care about formally modeling, how do you define security? Like what is a mathematically rigorous notion for the system to be secure? And we want to build cryptographic schemes whose security can be reduced to well-known assumptions. Like for instance, assuming, we have one-way functions, can we, let's say, build, what's a good example? Can we build a digital signature scheme that allows you to sign messages? And you want to like prove the scheme secure by reducing its security to like some well-known assumptions. So these are the main differences. But I mean, of course, everything is still also like connected, right? Like often when we design secure systems, we would be using crypto building blocks.
Good. So, okay. So, is this a correct way to say essentially crypto maybe is more theoretical part of system security, which is a more practical area essentially?
Yeah. So in our field, like crypto is the more theoretical side of things, and then system security is like the more system side of things.
So like for example, in algorithms, I think that's like the case also. I mean, we are doing essentially in theoretical computer science, we learn about algorithm and we are doing a lot of algorithms, but these are like more theoretical. In practice, we are using more heuristic based on this algorithm. So in some sense, I can say maybe that's the case also for system security, that, I mean, system security in some sense use the concept of crypto and others essentially to make essentially a system, I mean, secure. And do we prove essentially in system security that the system is secure, or it's like, are there rigorous proof like the same way that is cryptography essentially is done, or?
So I mean, some works like have let's say proofs, like some works have proofs either about, let's say, part of the system. I mean, the one thing is like when it comes to real world systems, like it's like typically more complex, and there are other considerations, like sometimes you know, let's say user factors, like HCI. How do you design this user interface so people will make the correct choice? Like, you know, how do you design, like, you know, when you browse website, if the certificate isn't correct, like how do you design a user interface so, you know, people will make the right choice? So these are sometimes factors that are not captured by existing cryptographic schemes. And when you design real world systems, you have to take like all these other aspects into account.
Great.
So typically, I guess, I mean, in some, depending on the work, type of work, I think some works have provable security, let's say, for the whole system, but more often than not, like some works, maybe they have like a core part of the system where they prove secure, but then there's all these other bells and whistles, or other parts that are maybe not, they don't exactly fit within like the capabilities of crypto modeling today. Yeah.
So yeah, I think so that essentially, like my understanding, as you mentioned, essentially, like system security maybe is actually more general than some, I mean, like area like crypto, essentially. And can you tell us a few, I mean, like a famous, I mean, conferences in both crypto and essentially system security, like essentially for the researchers in the field that they want to read papers or others?
In security area, I guess the top 3 conferences are IEEE Symposium on Security and Privacy. This is what we call Oakland, because it used to be the case that the conference always like took place in Berkeley, but because the conference has grown, nowadays it's like in the Bay Area, but it's no longer always like in Oakland or Berkeley. But we still have the name Oakland for this conference.
That I heard the name. Yeah.
There's another
IEEE conference actually.
Right. So the other 2 top security conferences, one is ACM CCS, and I'm actually co-chairing ACM CCS right now. So I want to like advertise it. And this is, I think, it's actually the biggest among the top 3 security conferences. And then there's also Usenix Security. And then in crypto, the top conferences are Crypto and Eurocrypt, I would say.
Yeah, I think these are like the top conferences essentially that they are doing. And I think generally, I think the papers are more, I mean, I have seen some of these papers like more theoretical essentially in crypto and Eurocrypt. And I think, I mean, and potentially, I mean, if you have a security or crypto, you can submit to both of them, but you will consider whether it is more theory to go crypto or it's like more general system that will go essentially to system conferences essentially. Good. So I think, so that's like, I think just to give that, like, for example, in algorithms, if you are working, essentially the top 3 conferences are Soda, Fox, Stock, essentially, that you are doing. There are some conferences like EC, essentially, that economics and computations, if you are publishing more in that things. And of course, there are several other areas that we cannot say all the conferences there. But one other question. So is there any relation between ML and essentially system security? Especially because you studied ML first also as well before going to this. So what is the main? Yeah.
Now it's actually a big area in security, like basically exploring the intersection of machine learning and security. And there are many questions you can ask. Like one is to understand, you know, adversarial machine learning is like one hot topic, but also, you know, you can ask, you know, how do we use machine learning techniques to like improve security and privacy, like how to do intrusion detection. So these are kind of applying machine learning techniques to security problems. But then like adversarial machine learning is like you apply like a security crypto perspective to like understand the robustness of like machine learning algorithms.
Great. Yeah, actually, I mean, like I think that's a good place also that we can talk a little bit about also privacy. So in some sense, essentially security or system security is the one that like if you, I think, build a website, you want to have a secure website. You don't want that the people, attackers, they can leak it. Essentially, they can attack and get some of your information. That's the thing. So I think the other side of that is privacy. And privacy is the part that now you care about the users. In some sense, now you want to say that maybe this, essentially, these systems or this website, these are the hackers, essentially. They try to get information from users. So that's the kind, and somehow I think that's my view, is that like it's somehow complement of the other part. Like, okay, you sometimes you say that use you want to make sure that when there are some malicious users, essentially you secure your system, that would be system security. But whenever there are some kind of malicious software, now you want to essentially keep essentially security and safety of the users. That becomes essentially privacy. So I think in that case, so I mean, so can you tell us a little bit more about like the privacy preserving computations?
Right. So there are many different techniques to achieve privacy preserving computation. Like you said, like one approach is like, you know, because data leaks happen, you know, due to software vulnerabilities, like we could first try to fix software security. You know, if you can build, you know, basically secure systems without any vulnerabilities, and maybe that's a way to secure your data and prevent data breach. But I also want to mention, like, there are a lot of exciting directions in cryptography that helps with data privacy. Like, for instance, let me take multi-party computation as an example, right? So in multi-party computation, let's say, you know, we have a bunch of hospitals and they each have their patient records, and they want to do some joint clinical study on the union of these databases, but maybe they cannot share the patient records with each other because of, you know, regulations. So in this case, they can actually run the protocol called the multi-party computation protocol. And the point is, at the end of the protocol, they learn the statistic they want to compute. But besides the statistic, nothing else is revealed about the databases for each individual hospital. So there's a long, this was actually initially proposed by, you know, Andy Yao, and also in this very nice work by Goldwasser et al. And it was first proposed, I think, about 30 years ago. But since then, there has been a long line of work that aimed to make multi-party computation efficient. Today, actually, there are, you know, several companies that are trying to commercialize multi-party computation technology. I mean, there are other crypto primitives that also helps with privacy preserving computation, like zero knowledge proofs. Like zero knowledge proof is this cool primitive where you can prove to others that, let's say you know something. Let's say you know, let's say I want to prove to people I have some money in my account, and I want to spend this money, but I don't want to reveal like who I am or how much money is in my account, or which is my account. So when you build like such an application using zero knowledge proof, like you can use it to build privacy preserving cryptocurrency. Like Zcash is a cryptocurrency that basically heavily relies on zero knowledge proofs. So this is another like popular technique for zero knowledge privacy preserving computation. And zero knowledge proofs are actually in huge demand, like by various blockchain projects. So like in the past decade or so, there's also like a line of work that basically keeps improving these practical zero knowledge proof constructions. So I also worked on a line of work called Oblivious RAM. And so this is also needed in a lot of different settings. So in Oblivious RAM, the concern is like, so let's say I store some data on the cloud provider, and then so the data can be encrypted, right? So, I care about my privacy. I encrypt the data, but I may be doing some computation on the data, and I'm accessing the data like, anytime I need to read some part of the data, I will go to the server and ask the server to return to me, let's say, location 5. But oftentimes, just observing this access pattern can leak very sensitive information. Like, for instance, if you do a binary search, let's say I'm searching for, in a sorted database, I'm doing binary search for a certain record. And if the server just observes the access patterns, like you look at the middle and you go left, and then you go right? So this will exactly reveal what key you are searching.
Yeah, just one thing essentially. I think it tells me that there are 10 seconds remaining. I think maybe it is just a limit. I didn't know that there's a limit. So I think if it is the case, I will go again live and then we will continue.
Hey, yeah, we're back.
Yeah, so we are back. So I think I didn't know actually that because I have done it before. Maybe I like with other people that I have done it. I mean, they have done it actually. Like the interview with me. I mean, there was no limitation, but I think it is the same thing as like Zoom started this essentially 40 minutes. Google Hangout or Google Meet now has 1 hour, and I think Instagram also had this kind of limitation. But anyhow, I think I already put the other one essentially live so the people can see it. Now this is the second one. Great. So I think we were talking about is essentially privacy and essentially the different type of privacy essentially.
Yeah, so I was explaining oblivious RAM. So oblivious RAM is like, so again, the problem is like, even if your data is encrypted, let's say if the server can observe the access patterns, like how you're accessing the data, it can leak a lot of sensitive information. Like for instance, binary search is an example, right? Because if you can observe, you're looking in the middle, you go left and you go right, it reveals exactly, how large or how small the number you are searching. So oblivious RAM is like, actually this is an algorithmic technique that allows you to completely obfuscate the access pattern. So the thing that's unintuitive is that you can, it's kind of like encrypting the access pattern. So you don't leak any information at all, and you don't have to pay too much cost. Logarithmic or polylogarithmic costs. So what's unintuitive in the beginning is like, we can encrypt data, right? This is something that we are used to thinking about. But how can we encrypt like access patterns of a program? Like this seems like a side effect of the program's execution. So like a line of my work like focused on building efficient oblivious RAM schemes. So we were actually able to, so before our work, like oblivious RAM was like a theoretical construct. They were not like, we're pretty far away from practical. And we basically proposed like a new paradigm for constructing oblivious RAM schemes that made it really practical. And the schemes are really, really simple. It's like a, I mean, this is a bad comparison, but it's kind of like a binary search tree. It's as simple as a binary search tree, but in some sense, actually even simpler. And we made it possible to like, actually implement oblivious RAM schemes. Like for instance, actually in the secure processor, like what's really cool was like a team at MIT, they actually taped out a secure processor running a variant of the so-called Path-O RAM scheme. In order to tape out the secure processor, so first it's pretty expensive. It costs about like $350K, and then you send the design to a factory and you wait like eagerly for 6 months for the chip to come back. And when it comes back, so this is not my work, but I was in close conversation with the two students working on it, and they told me, okay, when it comes back, like it's not guaranteed it'll work. But of course, like they were going to do their thesis on, based on this topic. So they were really betting, I hope it would work. But in this case, it turned out everything did work. And they were able to like complete their PhD dissertation. And now they're both like assistant professors in UIUC.
Good. So essentially, yeah, there's some betting on some kind of practical and something essentially. Okay, so I think like to just give some kind of, again, from, I think you mentioned, some more researchy part, but essentially, the thing that I understand is like, or I can mention it essentially, is that, we discussed about the system security, the privacy, a system for the essentially website, say, privacy for users. And this type of essentially, we have a different type of privacy. We can talk a little bit about other type, but this one essentially about the oblivious RAM is that we want to make sure that even if your essentially data is encrypted, but the pattern of access to this data is still, it may reveal some information. We talk about this kind of zero knowledge information. So zero knowledge in some sense is that, you have some, as Professor Shi mentioned, essentially, we have some, say, I have some knowledge. Say, this actually happens quite a bit in US. So if you want to buy a house, the person, the seller essentially asks your agent to prove that you have the money essentially. And at the same time, you don't know these guys essentially. You don't know whether you get the home even or not. And you want to say that I have the money, but you don't want to reveal that much information essentially from your side essentially. What are your bank accounts? What are the money that you have it? Because, who knows what will happen essentially if you release this information. So in some sense, that's essentially the concept of zero knowledge. That's a very important and practical thing, that I want to prove for you that you have it, while essentially you should not get essentially some of my like information. This is also important. This zero knowledge actually turns out this is introduced by Shafi Goldwasser and others essentially. And Shafi actually got Turing Award, which is essentially equivalent of Nobel, like Turing in computer science, it is equivalent of Nobel Prize in other essentially areas. And that also has like lots of application regarding the approximation algorithms and algorithms. So it's a very nice knowledge, and that's essentially it is the theory. That's the interesting thing about the theory, that you may introduce something for some essentially areas, but it may have application in lots of other areas. And I think that's the interesting things about this. Area essentially the zero knowledge. Professor Shi mentioned essentially these are like Zcash. It's based on this idea that essentially you don't leak any information. And I think can you explain a little bit about the Zcash? Idea that what is the main idea that they are using this zero knowledge essentially about it?
So basically, imagine like the cryptocurrency systems records all the coins that are there, right? So a coin, like a cryptocurrency.
Sorry, just before that, maybe actually, yes, you can talk a little bit more generally about the crypto and the different. Like essentially this kind of cryptocurrencies and blockchain essentially, and then talk about more of this essentially about the Zcash and other things like the proof of stake versus proof of work and other stuff essentially. Yeah.
I guess blockchain and cryptocurrencies, like they are decentralized systems, right? Like for instance, the main thing that a cryptocurrency system does is it keeps like a public ledger, but you can do that without relying on any central bank or central server. Basically, imagine there's a system of distributed nodes, and they jointly, together they keep track of like a public ledger. They record all the transactions that have ever taken place, and when you can do that, you get a cryptocurrency system. And obviously, the first cryptocurrency that became popular was like Bitcoin, and then afterwards we had smart contract systems like Ethereum. So not only can you perform like transactions, not only can you pay and buy coffee with cryptocurrency, you can also run programs on top of a cryptocurrency. So with that, you could implement like rich contractual agreements, like you could realize different financial instruments using a smart contract language. So I was actually among the first academics to start working on cryptocurrency. And I also have an interesting story for that. I guess like when I was doing my PhD, I was pretty fascinated by this concept of anonymous eCash. So these were like an earlier generation of like digital currency design, which gives privacy, and they actually anonymous eCash also made use of zero knowledge proofs to guarantee the anonymity of the transactions. And so, one thing is like there were indeed efforts at getting anonymous eCash systems deployed, but around 2021, I was like a researcher in Xerox PARC, and so one of my colleagues, and he was like one of the earlier Bitcoin miners, and he was like buying up GPUs and stuff and setting up like mining equipment in his house. So he was like really enthusiastic about Bitcoin, and every time like we had lunch at work, like he would tell me about Bitcoin, and then he got me really intrigued. So I was very fascinated by Bitcoin for one reason, like Bitcoin gained popularity. And I wanted to understand why. Like, for instance, why anonymous eCash didn't gain popularity so quickly, but Bitcoin did. So then I really looked at, the design of Bitcoin, and I was fascinated by the incentive aspects of the design. And I thought, oh, this is so cool. I must like make the academic community aware of this. And I wanted to like start doing research on this. So I wrote, I think it was like probably among the first academic publications on Bitcoin. So with my colleagues, like we wrote a paper called the Bitter to Better paper, how to make Bitcoin a better cryptocurrency. And then in that paper, like we try to explain Bitcoin in using like a more academic scientific language to kind of bring it to the attention of the academic community. And we also proposed like the first anonymous this mixing scheme for Bitcoin. Like mixing was like, you know, Bitcoin provided only limited anonymity because like you can, like it's pseudonymous, like in the sense that they don't know exactly who owns coin, you know, number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but they could track the spending of this coin. You know, coin 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 was, you know, paid to this other coin. So they could like track all this linkability information. So like it only gives very limited anonymity, and people found that you can easily break anonymity by doing some graph analysis, by like basically depicting, you know, the way these coins are connected to each other, and then you can kind of de-anonymize people. So I mean, there at that time, you know, people suggested like, let's have mixing schemes where we take a bunch of coins and put it into a big transaction and then split it up into like a bunch of outcomes. And now you kind of break up the linkage between the inputs and outputs. But earlier designs were like, they relied on the central trusted server to do this. But, you know, the drawback of this is like it's centralized, and this service provider could just like take all the coins and walk away with it. So we actually designed some fair exchange protocol, so you can do this without having to rely on any central trusted party in that same paper. So that was like the first Bitcoin paper I wrote, and then I joined University of Maryland, and then at that time I also met a great student whose name is Andrew Miller. He is now assistant professor in UIUC, and he was like really fascinated by Bitcoin, and we started working together. And at that time, I got really intrigued by smart contract programming language. So back then, Ethereum was like still a testnet, so I started looking into, you know, smart contract, and I wrote a paper about privacy preserving smart contracts. So this was also like among the first. I think it was perhaps like the first academic publication on decentralized smart contracts. And then we also, like, I also taught smart contract programming to my undergrads in UMD. And we discovered, like, you know, smart contract programming is actually, you know, in some sense, it's not like traditional programming. There are a lot of additional challenges with respect to smart contract programming. So we like wrote some kind of position paper that observed all these differences between smart contract programming and traditional programming. And that paper also like later on became very well cited. So this is how I got into like Bitcoin and like cryptocurrency research.
Good. So I think you can, I mean, like the people who are interested essentially in more research, I think they can go to Professor Elaine's publication. So where were like the two important ones, I think that you mentioned, where did this paper appear essentially, if they want to look at it more?
That's also interesting. Like for instance, I mean, in academia, sometimes when you write a paper about something new, then people like maybe they're not aware of these new concepts yet. So like when we first wrote the smart contract paper, this privacy preserving smart contract paper called Hawk, it got rejected several times, and we were like, we thought it was a great paper and a great idea, but it kept getting rejected. And eventually it got into a top conference, which is this Oakland Security Conference. And afterwards, I think it became like one of the top cited security papers like in the past several years.
Yeah, so I think this was the Oakland, which year?
2015, I think.
Okay, yeah. So that's, I mean, the thing that you mentioned actually is a great thing. So essentially that also comes to this concept of essentially theory versus practice. Because I mean, that this is one of the things that I have also noticed, that when, for example, I went to Google essentially 2016, 2017, essentially part of 2018 as well. So at that time, I think there was the MapReduce. The people, I mean, they were working. There are some people more on the programming side, they were doing it. But like the theory community didn't think that the MapReduce is actually a nice thing. So the first paper that I noticed, I went essentially, we ran some programs there that it was like almost in, I think, 12 trillion edges, a network of that. We could cluster it using this MapReduce or Hadoop or Spark, essentially others that the people know the same technology. It is called massively parallel computation. In less than a minute, actually, we could cluster such a huge network at Google, essentially. And that was like amazing to me. That's the thing that, I mean, we have done more essentially theory of this map reducing. But the early papers essentially got rejected, I mean, from top conferences. This happens essentially almost for any new thing, any novelty that you have, it may happen essentially. I think Shafiq Wasser was, I heard from her also, I mean, I heard essentially, then directly from her, from others, that like the first paper that they have also about this kind of, this multi-prover essentially.
Zero knowledge proof paper. I think the story is that it got rejected 6 times, and I even know a person who reviewed it and rejected it. I'm not going to say obviously, but.
Sorry, what was the last thing that you mentioned? I didn't hear.
The paper got the zero knowledge proof paper, right? I mean, now it's like a big field. The original paper got rejected 6 times, and that was the story. And I actually, I talked to someone who actually told me he reviewed the paper and rejected it because he didn't understand what it was about.
Yeah, so that's exactly the case. I think this novelty, if you want to change the field, that in some sense is like harder, especially I would say that it's harder in theory type of things essentially. Because like in theory, if you work in like the general, like essentially common approach to have a paper like in soda fox, it's like essentially that you take one of these papers in the previous essentially conferences and try to improve it, generalize it, and then publish it there. But this is actually some kind of, it can be considered incremental work, especially in more practical conferences, because there they generally like Sigmetrics, or I think probably the system conferences and others, or even like essentially NURIPS and others maybe, that they want some new concept that will be added essentially. So, but yeah, sometimes even in those conferences, if you add a new things, they may not believe it essentially. So you should have always confidence and essentially submitting a lot. If it's a good paper, of course, you should try to, I mean, believe in it. Of course, if there are some comments from the referees, I think you can always go and apply them. That generally helps, because in some sense, if it is something not clear for the referees, there might be some of, essentially, I will say to my students, that is our problem in some sense. We need to clarify that. And then, I mean, we submit it, but essentially that happens almost for all important papers in the field, lots of them at least, that they may not, at the beginning, they may not accept it quite well, but later essentially become very well-known papers essentially, or work in the area essentially. And so I think we talk about this theory versus system several times. So I think you have done both theory and essentially systems. So how do you see the intersection of essentially systems and theory? And so I mean, I think now you are working more on theory essentially, and before you were working more on system. Which one you like more essentially, and what should be the correct way essentially of interaction between these two?
I mean, I guess what I'm happy to see is I think like the intersection between the two is actually growing. Like, I mean, especially in the security community. Like, I think now, for instance, applied crypto is a big area. Like, I'm chairing the CCS conference, and applied crypto is like the largest track. We have the most number of submissions and most number of accepted papers. So this is like something that I'm very happy to see. I mean, I personally do think there are a lot of exciting problems at the intersection of the two. You know, like some of the theory problems we solve, like eventually, you know, they're more often than not, like, you know, they're motivated by practical problems we encounter. So, but oftentimes, like, you know, for maybe for mathematicians, when they prove the theorem with like, you know, big O asymptotical overhead, they're done. But there's still actually a big gap between you know, your theoretical construction to practical deployment. And I think that there's a lot of opportunities like in between. And I like working at the intersection of the two. I think it's great.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I enjoyed a lot. I mean, like, essentially, I will say maybe half of my life, essentially, I mean, even after I started my PhD, I was half in academia, half in industry in some sense. And I mean, the industry also is very nice. I mean, like, especially when you work there, essentially, then you will see the problems. And some of the things, like theoretical things that you say, okay, I can just write this algorithm, but it might be just too complicated for them even to implement the simplest algorithm that you can imagine, essentially. And you need to, I mean, essentially do a lot of work to get it essentially into practice. And I mean, that's interesting that, I mean, like, what is the important thing in practice? You can see like more, like, for example, when I was at Microsoft, Google, AT&T before essentially, and Amazon, and like Overstock now. And some of this experience that I had it is that, I mean, you design some algorithms, and then, as I mentioned, it might be not easy to implement at all, essentially. You need to design several algorithms. Maybe one of them you can convince that it's actually a good algorithm to implement. And they have their own essentially reservations because of lots of things that, like me, maybe as a theoretician, I don't understand it. But of course, if you know those limitations, then you can design essentially better algorithm for them. At the same time, one other thing so this is that essentially go from theory to practice. At the same time, from practice to theory, also I have seen very good things. For example, it happened to me like essentially MapReduce. I saw that the people are using a lot essentially in practice, and then try to have some theory for that essentially. Similar things, I mean, for several machine learning things that I'm seeing that are essentially they are like word2vec, or I don't know, some kinds of like XGBoost or other type of things that I see that the people are using it a lot in practice. Now the question is that still there is not, I mean, we don't know why they work essentially so well. So in that sense, actually adding theory to something that you know works well in practice, that might be great as well. I mean, first you will understand it better. At the same time, you may want to add to it essentially later, and that you can improve it. So I think I found actually great. Essentially, it takes a lot of, I mean, it takes a good amount of work, essentially. You need to know the language of practitioners, and they need to know somehow, you need to teach them also the language of essentially theoretician. But at the end, I think the thing that happens, it can be actually very substantial work. And again, the paper that maybe the first time you submit it, or second time, or up to 6th time, it may get rejected. It's a good topic. That happens a lot. But at the end, I think the people will appreciate essentially the thing.
Yeah, blockchain is also a great example, like for this theory to, practice to theory direction. Because in blockchain, like, you know, you always have the feeling the industry is actually ahead of academia, like they're deploying schemes, let's say incentive economic, you know, game theoretic, like mechanism design, like which we don't actually theoretically understand yet. And then, you know, I always feel like, oh, we are kind of trying to catch up. And now, like, for instance, now, one topic I'm very excited about is to understand the economic and incentive aspect for blockchains. And like in this space, for instance, like the classical mechanism designs don't work. Like for instance, like one that we can take like the transaction fee mechanism as an example. So I've been recently thinking about transaction fee mechanism design a lot. Like this is because like the space on the blockchain is scarce, and lots of people are trying to get their transaction confirmed on the blockchain, right? So there's an auction for people to bid, and you know, like the highest bidders can get their transactions confirmed. So this is like the auction that's, for instance, running in Bitcoin today. So how do you design like a good incentive compatible auction? I mean, if we like go back to classical mechanism design, like perhaps second price auction is like the golden standard, but unfortunately it just completely doesn't work in this decentralized environment, because even the auctioneer can be a strategic player. Like classically, more often than not, we typically assume, you know, the auctioneer is like trusted and will implement the honest mechanism. But now, like for instance, we actually have to consider like the auctioneer, like in the blockchain case, it's the miner. Like the auctioneer can be a strategic player, and then we want to design a scheme that's kind of, you know, incentive compatible both for the auctioneer and the players as well. So there are lots of like plenty of incentive mechanism design problems like this in the blockchain space. And I'm pretty excited about this direction in general.
Yeah, I think that you mentioned, so I think like this is my understanding also about the field. Essentially, we have this concept of blockchain essentially to make, I mean, before it was this kind of centralized things that the people, you could go there, you trust Google, I mean, these big companies or government. Now, in the blockchain, I mean, the idea is that, I mean, you don't trust anyone. I mean, in some sense, you trust the one that most people essentially trust. That's essentially the way that you are doing. Essentially, somehow, the mass of people, if trust on something, if this is the correct way of essentially the chain that continues, you trust that one. It's not just by one person, essentially, by more majority. And so that's essentially the idea. But then the issue is that as long as, and then the idea, of course, I mean, Bitcoin is based on that, or other cryptocurrencies are based on that. But that is not, I mean, that's just a start. As soon as you have that one, then no more economics concepts are coming, essentially like financial concept. Of course, Bitcoin by itself essentially is some kind of money that the people are now using it. But on top of that, I mean, like now the concept, the fact that there is no central essentially person or central authority, then that actually makes the life maybe much harder because not everyone can play a game essentially.
Right. That's when the crypto comes into play. And I think one exciting aspect, like why I found blockchain so technically fascinating, is because it's like the place where cryptography, distributed systems, and like game theory mechanism design, they all come together. And I mean, this also makes it like, you know, challenging to have like formal mathematically rigorous models to like reason about the system. But I like these challenges. I think, I mean, it's also important.
Yeah, so the mechanism design or action design, of course, and the area that I'm working also a lot. And some of the earlier works that we had it was like that. We try to design truthful mechanisms. Truthful mechanisms are those mechanisms that you want to say that if somebody lies, that doesn't get any benefit. It may get the same benefit, but nothing essentially more than that. These are very important if we can essentially design something. Like this second price action is one type of this essentially. Yeah. And of course, we may lose something in terms of revenue or others that we can discuss essentially others. But this concept of designing truthful mechanisms is very important essentially in the field. And some of the earlier papers that we had it was like that if you want to make everything truthful algorithmically, it would be actually very hard. And you may lose a lot of essentially cost of doing that. Efficiency becomes much worse. But always it's a good idea that, I mean, some of them you force it essentially by some physical things. And these physical things actually, they can be crypto stuff. That you can apply this crypto stuff essentially, make sure that some of this information essentially, some of these ideas of crypto, if you are using, you can have kind of truthful mechanisms. At the same time, the efficiency of the system is much better essentially. And again, this, go ahead.
That's a very good point. I think crypto like enriches the design space. Like it's a very powerful tool. Like crypto can often do like magic, right? You can do things that you would otherwise think is like unintuitive or not possible. But crypto can help you do that.
Yes. So I think, yeah, that is like so this is the area of essentially the blockchain, essentially the cryptocurrency type of things, and essentially this mechanism design, they all come together. I think that's the area that in some sense the people actually say that maybe in this area is like one person cannot be essentially like, it was not like, I don't know, 500 years ago that one person, it was the best scientist, best mathematician and others. Of course, now you cannot be like that essentially. There's so much areas that you cannot cover. But at the same time, I mean, if like you are working essentially and working on mechanism design, if I don't know that much blockchain, or a person who is working on crypto does not know, or system security does not know that much about essentially economics and computation, lots of this will not happen. So I think some of the people ask essentially about if they want to do PhD and like other things, what is the good area? I always say that it is good that you know lots of areas, because possibly you can connect them later essentially. And the PhD is one of the best, like when you are a graduate student, that's the best time for you to go there, understand these areas essentially and learn, because at that time this is expected from you that you will read a lot of papers. When you become professor, it might be harder for you because you have lots of other obligations. You may read less papers. But if you can understand more areas, if you can connect it, that's the thing that often is hard essentially, because you need to be expert in a few areas. And this is, I think that's a good thing. And of course, collaboration between the people also, that would be great essentially.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I totally agree.
Yeah, and I think good. So, and I think like one question I think essentially about this proof of. I think also you have done any project essentially with Vitalik as well. I think the Vitalik is essentially the famous person who has done this essentially for Ethereum. I think like Bitcoin was the one before, but I think nobody still knows who was the inventor of Bitcoin. Am I right? Or I mean, there are some guesses essentially. Yeah.
No one knows the inventor of Bitcoin.
Yeah, but I think go ahead.
I just say Vitalik. Yeah, I guess I got to know him pretty early, because I think I was maybe among the first academics that got interested in smart contracts. So when Ethereum was still a testnet, like we had invited Vitalik to visit us in UMD. Yeah, I think that was the case. I just don't remember, but we started kind of talking to each other pretty early on. I think this was like 2013-ish or something, when I was still in Maryland. And then when I went to Cornell, like we created a blockchain initiative called the IC3, and Vitalik also came to like our events. Like we organize this boot camp in Ithaca every year.
Yeah, I met. I think there was some kind of, round table or something like this, essentially at EC when it was in Cornell. Yeah. That we were essentially both talking. I think you and the panelists, you and Vitalik were both essentially panelists, and there were two other people.
Yeah, I remember that.
Nice panel that I have. Seeing that was talking about the different aspects of.
Yeah, definitely. I remember that. That was actually also in the middle of like our cryptocurrency boot camp. So Vitalik was actually visiting for like a week or 10 days or something. So we had fun.
Yeah. So are you still, do you have still continuing, the things with him, or he's like more, he's more wealthy and more maybe busy as well, essentially?
I guess we didn't collaborate on a research project together. But we did have conversations about a lot of technical things like distributed consensus and let's say SNARKs, like zero knowledge proofs. So yeah, I think hopefully, I like to think like maybe our research was like useful to the design of Ethereum.
Yeah, so generally, this question essentially about, we talk about blockchain and essentially all these related areas. So what is like the next essentially great, research, or like the main challenge essentially, both in research or non-research, like system or theory, for essentially blockchain that you think that is something that people should think about?
Like I said, and I think, so I guess, my interest has also been changing, right? So like, for instance, when I was in Cornell, like I would say in the past, how many years, like 7, maybe 5 to 6 years, my main interest was focused on making consensus scalable on a large scale. So it turns out actually some of the mathematical foundations for consensus, like the classical mathematical foundations, were not a good fit for this decentralized setting. So we basically built a new mathematical foundations. We constructed new protocols for large-scale distributed consensus. And in the past couple of years, I started to become more interested in the mechanism design, economics, and incentive aspects. And this is like a very, very open field, because a lot of the times we actually don't even know what is the right model, like what is how to mathematically model these incentive problems we encounter in these blockchain designs. And like you said, this is actually an area where industry is a little bit ahead. Like they're deploying these protocols, incentive compatible protocols, but a lot of the times they're based on heuristic design. And so, I also think there's a lot of opportunities just because it's like a new field that no one fully understands yet.
Yeah, so I think this consensus, I think that you mentioned, has actually, I've done some work more recently on that essentially. That's actually nice things, and that is actually a great research area. So I think this consensus essentially, application essentially. So in consensus in some sense is really, the consensus is that, the question is that, there are some people believe on something. You want to make sure at the end, everyone believes on that thing essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is very similar, of course, to the concept of, blockchain, because that's the whole idea that the majority think that is the right chain, essentially. So, and there's a lot of work actually in that, but as you mentioned, I think, like, the computation, models of computation are changing. So, for example, this MapReduce stuff or massively parallel computation, these are different from the way that we were thinking about parallel algorithms or PRAM, 20 years ago. So it changes essentially, and with these new models, essentially, maybe new revisit and new ideas is needed. That's exactly the thing that we were doing for MapReduce versus PRAM, essentially, that exists. And so, also one other thing, what about like differential privacy? I think that's also a famous thing. So as we discussed, essentially, oblivious RAM essentially is, here we try to have some kind of privacy of the access essentially to a database that you have. You want to make sure that, even from your access, nobody can get any information. And again, somebody think about why this is important. I mentioned that even, like I think you mentioned that zero knowledge, that is even more, like essentially is already there. there you don't want to leak even, any information. Here we may, essentially leak some information, but maybe essentially having more limitations. Now, what about differential privacy? How do you, essentially compare differential privacy or with essentially this oblivious RAM type of things, essentially?
Okay, so yeah, let me answer your questions one by one. So first, I guess you kept bringing up this massively parallel computation, and I also wanted to say I also like massively parallel computation, the model a lot. So I also had some work that actually bridged the algorithmic model of massively parallel computation with crypto. Like, so we actually had a couple papers that show how to do secure multi-party computation in the massively parallel computation model, like for these large-scale data analytics tasks. And I think, in this space, I think there's also like a lot of interesting open questions too. But back to this differential privacy question, I guess differential privacy, like, is kind of orthogonal. It answers a different question than, let's say, secure multi-party computation or oblivious RAM. So like in secure multi-party computation or oblivious RAM, typically the way we define security is to say, we want the protocol to leak only, let's say, the outcome, the outcome of the computation, but not leak anything else. Nothing else is leaked. But it doesn't actually answer, okay, what kind of outcome is okay to leak? Like when you're leaking this outcome, are you actually potentially breaching an individual's privacy? So this is like the question that differential privacy tries to answer. Like if I publish, let's say, this statistic, will I be actually breaching any individual's privacy? And of course, there's a beautiful line of work on differential privacy as well. I've also done quite a lot of work on differential privacy. You also mentioned the relationship between differential privacy and oblivious RAM. Actually, these two also have intersection because, like, I also have a new line of work called differentially oblivious algorithms. And this is where we kind of apply the notion of differential privacy to access pattern. And the goal here, of course, is like oblivious RAM is like when you say, I want the access pattern to be kind of encrypted. I don't want access pattern to leak anything. But then now we are asking, okay, if you allow the access pattern to leak, let's say, a little bit, but we want the leakage to be differentially private, importantly. Like this is mathematically quantifiable leakage. Then can we design like, more efficient schemes, both in theory and in practice? So, all of these areas, they're not like, completely disjoint either in the sense. they can have nice interactions.
Yeah, I think to have only a summary of the things that you mentioned, essentially, I think that might be good for the general audience as well. So in some sense, there are two types of privacy. Say you want to do some computation. Like the issue is that, there are two things here. One is that how do you compute, or the way of computation to get the result? That's the part essentially that we talk about multi-party computation, or like the secure computation, or this oblivious RAM, like even who sends some information to others. The way that this computation happens, there is some security issues here that we want to make sure that if somebody, essentially some attacker attacks this, they cannot get essentially the idea from it. Then the idea is that, okay, maybe I'm releasing some information. At that time, that's the outcome, essentially, as Professor Shi mentioned. So at that time, then when I release this information, the outcome, it may leak some of this information from essentially user. So in some sense, maybe in the way of computation, somebody could attack and get some information from user or from the system. I would say probably more from user side. Also, after the computation, maybe I will say, okay, I don't care about, I'm doing very secret computation, or maybe I just do it myself. So I don't, essentially, there is no multi-party or anything. Google is doing that. But Google is still, for example, responsible for the next step, that if I release this information, I should not essentially release too much information for a particular person, essentially. Because if I mention, essentially, I think that was, like if I mention, for example, the city of the person, or like maybe a few, even identities of that, even if not the name, somebody can just search and essentially find that person. The idea is that, there is an official definition that essentially if there are, I think, two databases essentially that they are very similar, except maybe in one place, essentially, the adversary should not be able to distinguish between them. But the general idea is that this outcome that I'm giving, essentially, it should be something that the people cannot, essentially, they are not too much leaking information. And so, of course, there is this idea that is also nice that, from each information, we may leak a little bit information, I mean, a very small amount of things. And I think this is some kind of thing like called capacity of the, or essentially of.
Yeah, I guess in differential privacy, there's this important notion of privacy budget. That's like a mathematically quantifiable knob that describes exactly how much is leaked. And I think one of the, the biggest open questions or challenges for differential privacy is like, okay, how do we set this epsilon in practice? And typically, if you make more and more queries to the private data, or you publish more and more statistics, like this privacy budget will be consumed more and more. So like, how can you design mechanisms that avoid this kind of privacy loss over time? Or maybe you can more tightly bound the privacy loss over time. Like, I think these are some of the interesting open questions. I mean, there has been a lot of nice work already, but there are still a lot of like interesting open questions along these lines. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's essentially, I think these are like a nice area of like essentially for privacy for users, which is very important. And I mean, essentially, if you read the news, essentially, this is the big fight between Facebook and Apple, essentially, that Apple essentially try to do it more private type of things. Of course, I mean, there are some economic reasons for Apple as well, because if essentially these apps, if they cannot run it for free, they need to sell the apps, and then part of this actually 30% goes to Apple, I think. So there is this part. At the same time, there is the Facebook thing that, I mean, wants to get essentially more information, more cookies, and such that they can do more targeted advertisement, essentially. And that essentially is a big, essentially, like Facebook, I think, like from the, I think the top, like the stock price essentially, I think, went down by 45% essentially because of this issue. So these are very important issues. This privacy that somebody enforces essentially, then someone else essentially may pay the expense essentially for that. And great. So I think that was the thing. So I think we covered this one. And is there anything about the researchy part essentially, or I mean like the areas that I think the people should know about it and you want to say about that?
Is there anything about my research?
Yeah, I mean, essentially research in these areas about privacy, essentially about blockchain, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I like these areas a lot. I think, if you are considering going to grad school and considering what to study, you can keep this in mind. I mean, we've kind of talked a lot about research in this space, right? So, I mean, also, I think also partly I like it because it's like a lot of it is like at the intersection of theory and practice. And there are lots of exciting problems at the intersection. Like, you can try to bring the theory to practice, but you can also go the other way around, bring the practice to the theory, like, try to define new models, new problems, like, and try to investigate them from a more theoretical and mathematical perspective.
Great. Actually, by the way, I mean, these questions actually, some of them I collected from I put some kind of early announcement that I asked the people that if they have a question, please put it. So some of these questions I already collected essentially from the comments that the people put it. I think two important things, like essentially going back, essentially more maybe personal things and be a role model for others, essentially. So essentially, so do we have, I mean, as I like essentially a female computer scientist, have you seen any obstacle like now even essentially in the research community or others essentially that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess, I mean, I think the environment is definitely improving. And I would say, I mean, for me, like, as I mentioned, like maybe I wasn't so confident of myself, like especially earlier in my life. And I can kind of like I think it just took me a very long time to kind of discover who I really am and understand like what I really like doing. And I mean, for me also personally, for instance, I'm actually pretty bad at negotiation. And I think I always felt like the most successful negotiation in my life was like in high school when I somehow negotiated my way out of like all these standardized tests. And that time was like really, I really didn't want it. I didn't want to go to that computer programming contest. But anyway, yeah, I think overall the bigger environment has been like
Yeah, I think that is improving. I think this concept of essentially diversity, I think is very important. And I think we can go for this diversity and talk about, I think that is like gender, lots of other things also aspect of diversity that if the people consider it when they are hiring or others actually can be very helpful on that one. And do you have any message, I mean, for women in STEM fields, like they might be high school students or essentially maybe middle school and they want to do computer science, math, anything that you want to mention to them essentially?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe, I would say believe in yourself and like don't be afraid to tackle the big problems. Like I think this was also partly what I had learned in grad school. Like so somehow in the middle of grad school, like I figured, I want to kind of work on the hard problems, and I shouldn't be afraid to like work on hard problems. I shouldn't be afraid of like failures. And, I mean, the one thing is like to learn how to fail gracefully. Like even if, let's say I try to solve a big open question, I couldn't really solve this question. Like maybe I can learn something from the process and get like some partial results out of it. And then, try to still keep the bigger question in mind and try to like work on it for a longer term. And maybe someday you will indeed solve it, right?
Yeah, I think just don't be afraid, and if I don't think that, I mean, like I think that's the thing that I got it from your essential messages that we talk even about the research. So the fact that nobody considered this or nobody has done it, I think should not prevent you from doing that. That's a very important thing essentially. Always you should have, I mean, more confidence on yourself essentially and try to do the things that others have not done it. Again, like even in the research, you may do the same thing, they may reject your paper, but again, you should have a confidence and submit it and improve your paper, and that at the end, it may have a great, essentially, benefit for you and the community, essentially. So that's
a very good summary. I like that.
Essentially, I got it from the things that we discussed. So a great essentially, I think they asked, I mean, some questions essentially, like already, and if the other people have questions, they can just mention essentially, we will ask. One question actually some of the people have asked essentially, whether functional programming help smart contracts?
Sorry, what? Can you repeat the question?
Functional programming help smart contracts?
I mean, I guess, yeah, I mean, a lot of, so I think generally speaking, the cryptocurrency community is like, they have an appetite for these formal method and programming language techniques. Because like, oftentimes, like just writing a secure smart contract program is like error prone, right? Like, so you want to use these formal language tools like type systems or formal verification to like make sure, like, your smart contract doesn't have like, for instance, money leakage bugs, or it satisfies certain fairness properties. So there has been some very nice work in this space already. But there's, I mean, still there's like, I think more open questions than the ones that we have answered in this space.
Great. So I think that also answers, I mean, somebody also asked about, like they asked about the blockchain research problems. I think we discussed several of them, and I think this is also another one of those type of things about this.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. Personally, like I said, I'm very excited about incentive and mechanism design questions, and also questions at the intersection of like game theory and crypto these days. But of course, there's also a lot of other exciting questions to work on in the blockchain space as well.
Yeah, so that's actually a nice thing. I mean, because I think still the blockchain, I mean, how they have several papers have been published, still I think, like for example, theory conferences or even EC, they can still have more papers in this area. So still there's much more essentially, I think, perspective for them. In some sense, there's a combination of some of these concepts like distributed things essentially about like efficient computations, as well as essentially this kind of massive computations and this kind of economics and computation. But I think still there is a lot more essentially to be done for the combination. I think that was somehow the answer. I think I mean, these are the questions that I had essentially, and I think also that some of the audience had. So any other things, like the final things that you want to say essentially? Final message essentially, or other things essentially?
Are you asking me, or are you asking the audience?
No, I'm asking you essentially, yeah.
Oh, is there anything else I want to say?
That I missed essentially and you want to mention or something like that?
Oh, I mean, I enjoyed the chat. I guess I don't have more to add.
Great. Yeah, actually, that was very enjoyable for me because I think that's one of the things that I mean, we had this thing that we talk about or background essentially. I didn't know some of this that you mentioned essentially. And I think that was very important for me. And I think I'm sure for audience. So the plan is that, I mean, we will put this one essentially on the YouTube as well. So I think, and also as a, like, the people can come essentially and see it as a story, and we will put it on YouTube as well. So this would be some kind of permanent things that the people can come and see it. And I think know about the research stuff and our life and others essentially. I think that's a very good thing to know. I learned a lot from this essential conversation. And some of this, because I mean, generally, I think the best for me is to ask essentially experts in the field to get the best ideas about that. And anytime that I have a time to talk with them, I really appreciate it. And of course, I appreciate a lot for you, I mean, to coming and essentially we can have this live. I think that was great things. And I think we will continue this essentially with other people essentially. We talk with others, because I think, as I mentioned, this you will see a lot of people essentially, I don't know, become celebrity in industry essentially, in, I don't know, in like the Hollywood type of things and others. But scientists, I think in some sense, something not too many scientists talk about their life essentially. Maybe that's their problem, maybe the other problem, others they are not asking. But that's essentially the initiative that we are talking about it. And I think to encourage more people to essentially become great scientists in the future and don't be afraid essentially. I think that's like the whole idea. Great. So I think thanks everyone for participating essentially and for your time, Elaine. And I think
thank you so much for participating. Yeah, thanks to the audience. And if you have more questions, feel free to like reach out to me like through email.
Yeah, I think they can come. I mean, they can contact Elaine always from her homepage essentially at CMU. And I think also I think the email. I think they can just find your email there online. And
yeah, I think you will find the email from my homepage.
Yeah, that's actually interesting thing. For us, finding email is very easy. You can just go to any of our papers and our email is there. Like I mean, like other celebrities. I mean, if you want to find them, essentially, it's very hard to find the personal thing. But for us, it's very easy. You can just email, and I think we will check the emails very regularly. So anyone who has a question, you can just come and ask us essentially, email us, and I mean, we'll be happy essentially to talk more about. Great. So thanks a lot, and I think thanks everyone for participation, and I think that's it.
Okay.
So,
thank you.
The rest of the day.
I enjoyed it very much.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, and talk to you then later.
Okay. Talk later. Bye.
Bye. Okay. So we are going.